in true form,
Okay.
Just outside my window, the City of Stevens Point Recycling Service is picking up my recycling. How perfect is that, right? Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Johnson, and I am the director of the Marathon County Solid Waste Department, and I am the president of Associated Recyclers of Wisconsin. I want to welcome you all to this lunch and learn. I'm so glad that you're joining us. A little bit about ARO, or Associated Recyclers of Wisconsin. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We are an association that provides statewide proactive leadership on waste reduction and recycling through education, advocacy, collaboration, programs, and services. ARO has been very busy the last many years, connecting folks in this industry and others who are interested in waste reduction and recycling. And in fact, in the last 5 years, we've been responsible for working collectively with legislators to bring back $3 million to responsible units of recycling. We have convened a glass task force, which has helped to streamline the process for low hazard waste exemptions for the beneficial use of post-consumer glass. And most recently, we played a role in the changes to the electronics recycling law, which will help make that law a more efficient process for all involved. If you're not familiar with ARO and are not a member, and I strongly feel you should be, it's a great organization. You can't ask for better people. Just go to recyclemorewisconsin.org and click on the ARO tab, and you will be able to then find everything you need to know about ARO. And our topic today is Nothing Stays the Same, as we all know, and it's your opportunity to help shape the change for effective recycling programs. Thank you for joining us. Our presenter today is my good friend and colleague, Jennifer Semrau. She is the DNR's, our waste diversion and recycling coordinator for the state of Wisconsin. And I am going to hand this over to Jennifer.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Melissa, for that warm introduction. Really happy to be with you today. As many of you are aware, this past year, the Legislative Audit Bureau conducted an audit of the statewide recycling program. And with that audit, there were a number of recommendations that were in their final report. And we've been working to implement those recommendations at the DNR. And that includes taking a look at the administrative code, NR544, which specifies the regulations for our effective recycling programs. And so, today my intention is to kind of go through that code. So it's a bit dry. It's, digging in deep to administrative code, not necessarily the most entertaining topic, but in order for us to get feedback from recycling programs and other stakeholders, we feel you need to understand what's in the code now. So that is my plan for today. We do not have a approved scope statement yet as far as our administrative rule procedures. So we can't discuss specific actual code language that we might include in a revision, but we're looking to get feedback on overall attitudes and challenges, if you will, even with the current code, just as we inform that scope statement process. Also, you may be able to tell my voice is a little strained. For those of you who know me, I'm a huge Green Bay Packers fan and was at Monday night's game and had a lot of cheering to do at the end, at least. So my apologies for my voice, and I'll go ahead and get us underway. I will be stopping my video just to not pull on the Wi-Fi any more than necessary and sharing my slide deck. All right, so Melissa, could you please just verify that you can see my screen?
We can see it.
Okay.
Excuse me, Jennifer.
Yes.
Have you, zoomed the actual slideshow? Right now I'm seeing it in more of a a different format, at least on my screen.
Thank you for that. Let me try again. My intention was that it was in the proper.
Presentation mode, let's say, or start the slideshow.
Yep. So let me just try one more time, get it right. All right. Is it better now? If someone could confirm?
It is on mine, and I'm a recording, so it is good.
Okay. Thanks so much, guys. Okay, so to start, I wanted to discuss what does NR544 do overall. It sets the standards for our effective recycling program. So our responsible units are local units of government that are really the boots on the ground and implement the recycling program. It outlines all of the specifications for RUs. That includes the actions taken for collection, processing, having a recycling ordinance, as well as the annual reporting requirement. It also outlines how DNR approves those actual responsible unit programs when we have new applications. It also outlines provisions for probation when RUs aren't meeting the effective recycling program standards. And it also provides for variances to landfill bans. Finally, it also contains our specifications for MRFs, our material recovery facilities, which are used as part of effective responsible unit programs. However, I also wanted to be clear on what isn't covered in code. So these are things that we are not going to be able to change even when we look at updating code, because these things are in statute. These things are defined by the legislature, so not something that we would have the ability to modify. So one of those items is how RUs are defined. So what a responsible unit is, being a local unit of government, unless another alternative RU has been established, how an RU is defined is not something we will be able to modify. Something else outside of this scope will be which materials specifically are banned from landfill disposal, and therefore the materials that RUs are required to provide management for. Those materials are specified in statute. Another big concern or issue for the recycling program has been the recycling grant and the recycling grant formula. Our last Aero Lunch and Learn was on that topic specifically. That again is in statute, so that is not something that we will be able to modify with code revisions. Just wanted to start out with some questions to kind of have in the back of your mind to think about as I go through the content of NR544. These are items that we're seeking feedback on from our stakeholders. So does any particular portion of the code jump out at you as requiring modification? Looking at RU requirements, are there any needed actions for RU components? How can programs demonstrate that they have an effective recycling program? What checks are needed to maintain integrity of the recycling program? Again, we have over 1,000 responsible units, so how do we ensure that those programs are operating effectively? There's also specific standards that are in 544, such as the amount of recyclables that should be collected per person in responsible units, and other specifications. So do those make sense or need to be updated? And if they should be updated, if you have an idea of different data sources for replacements. There's also the checks and balances between RUs and MRFs, how they work together, and the MRF specifications specifically, if there's things that we should be changing. Another area that we may look at is not actually in 544, but in 50206, which is our collection and transportation of recyclables. So the specifications for haulers and what their expectations are for the recycling program. And then just in general, what should be offered by a recycling program for it to be effective for its customers? How should we be tracking those programs across the state? And just what improvements do you think could be made for responsible units or haulers or MRFs or any other player in the recycling system? All right, so now kind of getting into the nitty gritty, a walkthrough of NR544. So in the beginning, obviously just establishes the purpose of our code and the applicability. We also have a series of definitions that define everything that's related to the recycling program that I won't get into here. But one of the main content pieces is the components of an effective recycling program. So we do get into quite a bit of detail on what needs to be in an effective recycling program. One of those items is having an information and education program. So every responsible unit is required to educate their residents, and not just, single family to 2 to 4 units, but multifamily, non-residential, et cetera. So all of this information is specified in code. RUs are also required to have a recycling ordinance, and we have a bit more of that later on. They also have to have a system for the collection, processing, and marketing of recyclables for single family and up to 2 to 4 unit residences. That's the cap, if you will, on the actual residents that RUs are responsible for. It's up to 4 unit residences. It also specifies that they need to have equipment and staff necessary to implement that system, which can include contracting out, like for hauling or processing. RUs also must require that multifamily and businesses provide recycling. Again, they don't have to provide that service directly themselves, but they have to require that that occurs. They have to prohibit the disposal or incineration of recyclables, which have been separated for recycling. They also have to enforce their recycling program and have something called a compliance assurance plan, which is a guidance document that specifies how the RU will actually do that enforcement. Every RU needs to submit an annual report, which is where we, get a lot of this information and can check to make sure that RUs are operating effective recycling program. And then there's also provisions for managing waste consistent with our waste hierarchy and reducing overall the amount of waste generated. Then the next section of code gets into details on collection and processing systems. We do specify that collection systems for residents must separate recyclables from waste before collection. So basically the concept of like dirty MRFs, if you're familiar with that term, where recyclables and waste can all be together, isn't immediately approvable. There is a way to do it for an alternative collection or processing system. There's also specifications for compacting glass with newspaper and just overall maintaining marketable conditions for the recyclables that are collected. And then meeting the total collection standard, which I will get into a bit more later. But here's also where we specify the difference between what we call urban RUs, which are RUs with a population of 5,000 persons or more, or a population density of 70 people per square mile, and rural, which is basically smaller than the above. So it does specify in code currently that urban RUs must provide curbside collection at least monthly, or if they did not, they'd have to have a drop-off system that they could demonstrate was used by at least 80% of residences. Frankly, we don't have any RUs, I believe, that are doing the 80% of resident drop-off. Basically, all of the urban RUs have at least monthly curbside collection. And then again, if an RU is not considered urban but rural, then they are allowed to have a drop-off instead of curbside collection, and code does specify a minimum hours, 10 hours per month, that the drop-off should be open unless they can demonstrate that something else is adequate. For processing, the code does specify that RUs must use a self-certified MRF. This is important. We have had RUs, for instance, and sometimes our border communities where they switch contracts and decide to use a MRF that's outside of the state of Wisconsin and isn't certified with us. They can be, and we have gotten those MRFs certified, but just something to be aware of, that RUs are required to use a self-certified MRF. We also have specifications in code on what needs to be in a recycling ordinance. Some of the language that's included is that all residences, multifamily and non-residential, must separate out recyclables from the list that's specified in code, or send to a licensed mixed waste processing facility, which again is sort of that the dirty MRF where waste and recycling are going together, but we do not have any of those facilities in the state of Wisconsin. So again, the ordinance says everyone, there's no exemptions. If you live, work, or play in the RU, you should be recycling. The ordinance also must have specifications for multifamily and non-residential properties, that those properties provide adequate and separate containers, that they notify tenants or residents at move-in and twice per year of how and why to recycle, and then provide collection for the actual recyclables that are collected in the dumpsters at those facilities. The ordinance also must include a prohibition on the disposal of recyclables separated for recycling. And it also must include enforcement language, including appropriate penalties, and the dollar amounts for those penalties are actually prescribed in statute, and those must be included in the recycling ordinance. Just jumping down to record keeping, we also specify that RUs must maintain records for at least 3 years. Here then in code in 54408 is where we get into the initial program approval. So how we approve brand new RUs, which we still do get some of each year. And if somebody wanted to have an alternative program. So there's a lot of things that need to be submitted to the DNR when someone is going to become a responsible unit. They need to provide us with a copy of their ordinance, their compliance assurance plan. They also estimate how much recyclables they will be collecting, and what MRF and haulers they'll be using. They also have to provide descriptions of their education program, provisions for the multifamily and non-residential, and other items listed here. Again, if they wanted to suggest an alternative collection or processing program than what's been specified earlier in code, there's various information pieces that they need to provide, including, a comparison of pros and cons and costs of their alternative versus what's specified, and just a demonstration that it will be effective in recovering recyclable materials. When DNR receives an application, we have to complete our review within 90 days. We approve it if they've identified all of the necessary elements to have an effective recycling program and are projected to meet the collection standard, and denied if not. Another piece of 544 that, again, we get into quite a bit of detail on is the annual program report. So again, this is really important to us at the agency to make sure that recycling programs are operating effectively, and it's the one time a year where we interact with every single RU and get information on how they are operating their program. So they need to let us know how they're operating their program, including that their ordinance is still in effect, how they've been enforcing their ordinance, a description of their collection system, which a lot of this information is auto-filled from their previous annual report. So it's basically just verifying that things have not changed related to their hauler, their MRF, if they have single stream, curbside, all of those pertinent details. This is also where they provide us with their annual recycling tonnage. So this is where the department is able to say, how we're doing for annual recyclables collected is based on the information submitted in these annual reports. This is also where we take a look at if they're meeting the collection standard. And if they didn't meet the collection standard, there's some additional questions that pop up in the report that require some explanation on why they believe the standard wasn't met and how they can improve their efforts to meet that. They also provide us with information on their enforcement, including complaints and inspections, and other items that are listed here. We also specify in the code how we review the annual reports and what we would do If an RU annual report is something we can't approve, we have the options to place an RU on probation or terminate an RU or grant them an exemption. The termination of RU approval is not something that the program has tended to do. Only RUs in the state of Wisconsin that have an effective recycling program can landfill their waste in the state of Wisconsin. So it's a real challenge for the department to, suggest that we would say that a town, in the middle of the state and in Marathon County is, that we would terminate their effective recycling program, and they would then be forced to ship their waste to Minnesota or Illinois or Michigan or something. So instead, we really try to work with RUs, as best as we can, or placing them on probation to get them into compliance. With that probation, again, our code specifies that it cannot exceed 1 year, and RUs are to submit an action plan for how they're going to come back into compliance. We also have some information in the code on our exempt facilities, which are RUs that are located near 2 of the grandfathered in waste to energy facilities. These facilities are able to incinerate plastic and paper materials. So RUs in those areas are allowed to only establish a program for glass and metal recycling. Finally, also in code, we have variances and exemptions. So an RU does have the ability to request a variance from a part of code for the landfilling of a material for up to 1 year. DNR shall grant a variance if the cost to sell processed material exceeds $40 per ton. That figure was put in code back in 1989, so adjusted for inflation, it's more than double that now. And the other thing I want to point out is that it's the cost to sell processed materials, so not the cost to dispose of material picked up just at the curb. It would have to have been processed in order for us to, look at that analysis. Just a key word here in code. DNR also has the ability to initiate a variance, which we have actually done for plastics 3 through 7 in the state. Plastics 3 through 7 were included in the initial recycling law in chapter 287, but the department has issued a variance to allow the landfilling of those plastics, viewing that there were insufficient markets for those materials. Finally, there is also the ability to issue a variance in the event of an emergency situation. So one of the last parts here of NR544 has to do with our MRFs, our material recovery facilities. And here's where we specify MRFs that are going to be used as a part of an effective recycling program and some of their operational considerations. Included in this section of code is that MRFs must operate in a nuisance-free and an environmentally sound manner. They also have to maintain records that demonstrate that at least 75% of the materials that they took in a given year are recycled or transported off-site. So basically to avoid speculative accumulation of materials. MRFs are also obliged to keep recyclables in marketable condition. DNR has the requirement that we maintain a list of the self-certified MRFs, and we do have that information on our website. We do specify that single commodity MRFs are exempt from certifying. So if a MRF only deals in, say, cardboard or glass, for instance, they are not required to certify with the state. And then there's also specifications if a MRF were to close or have an interruption of service and the notification requirements for that. Prior to a MRF taking RU material, there are certain things that they submit to the DNR to become certified. That includes a description of their operation, what materials they'll accept, sort of like a process flow on how materials are received and stored and processed through the MRF, as well as their capacity, and their anti-nuisance procedures, how much residual they anticipate producing, as well as record keeping requirements, and specifying that they are not going to store recyclables in wetland or flood. MRFs also have an annual reporting requirement. So just like responsible units, we get RU reports due to us by April 30th of each year. MRFs need to submit reports to us by March 30th. In that report, they certify about their operations. They also provide us tonnage information on the amount of tonnage that they received, as well as the amount of tonnage that they processed and sent to end markets, and information on material sent to landfill as residuals. The department does have the ability to invalidate a MRF's certification due to significant discrepancies. If MRFs were to render recyclables unmarketable, failure to operate in a nuisance-free manner, and failure to operate per their certification. If an invalidation occurs, they can apply and be recertified. All right, this is my last slide. Thank you all for bearing with me on this content. It's, I know, like I said, pretty heavy. I've referred several times to the collection standard for responsible units, and this is where that comes from. You may have also heard the term Table 1 materials and Table 1 collection standard. The term Table 1 comes from the fact that in NR544, there's a table, and it's table number 1, and that's where this information is contained. So this is where we get the specifications for how much recyclables a rural or urban, which is basically a non-rural RU, needs to collect in order to have an effective recycling program. The amounts here on this chart are actually slightly higher than what we implement, because it includes foam packaging and plastics 3 through 7. So those items are not actually included in the annual report. So the collection standards are actually slightly lower than what is seen here. But this is where these numbers were arrived at, where we are judging whether programs are collecting, quote unquote, enough recyclables to be deemed an effective recycling program. And as I mentioned previously, if these indicators are not met, the responsible unit has some additional questions that come up on the annual report to indicate why they didn't meet the collection standard. This chart here specifically is definitely something that we know that we want to take a look at when we modify 544. These figures have not been reviewed or revised in many years. And we even identified that we intended to periodically revise these collection standards as conditions warrant. And so that's something that we are intending to do, certainly with this code revision. All right. So this is my contact information. And I know that I've only taken about, half of the time that we had scheduled for this lunch and learn, because I'm really hoping to get in feedback from folks. So I am going to maybe stop sharing my screen, unless you think I should keep this contact info up, Melissa.
I think keep it up for a little bit. Most of the people I see on this, I recognize the names, but there are a number of people I don't. So we want to make sure that people know how to get a hold of you, Jennifer.
That sounds great. And maybe after a minute, Melissa, I will go back to that slide that had some sort of the questions that we were interested in getting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. This is your time. I think Jennifer and the DNR have a huge task ahead of them, and we all are going to play a role in helping to support them in that process. And it's your time to either ask, and go ahead if you want to pop those questions up, Jennifer. Either ask the questions, provide some feedback, comments, concerns. It's your time. And I guess if you just want to, excuse me, I was not at the Packer game and I do not have COVID. I just have allergies. Excuse me. I can kind of scan through, and if people want to raise their hands, or it's not a big group, if you want to just go off of mute and start asking questions or providing some feedback on these questions. Or if you all just took a big bite of the sub you picked up and have your mouth full, please feel free to put it in the chat box. So let's start with the first one. I'm going to start calling on people because I do know many of you on this call or on this webinar. Does any portion of a particular portion of NR544 jump out as an area requiring modifications? I know a number of you have some strong feelings about that. And the person I'm going to start with first is Rick Myers. He's pretending he doesn't hear me.
I will say this, Melissa, this is Karen popping in, maybe a brief introduction, Karen Sig helping with us. But there have been times when people don't have, are not participating with a microphone. So
Okay.
I don't know, just otherwise put it in the chat. So I'll just a brief reminder, if you can't verbalize something, put something in the chat, please.
Sure. Yep. That's always an option.
Melissa,
All right,
we do have a question in the chat.
Okay, let's go with that. It says, when a new RU is created, is that because Wisconsin DNR notifies them or they realize they need to become one?
Yeah, this is a great question. So every municipality in the state is a part of a responsible unit. So maybe that's also something I didn't make clear. How we have new RUs is when I guess RUs break up, RUs divorce, that type of thing. So I guess an example that I can point to is last year, the Dunn County Responsible Unit dissolved. So previously, all of the municipalities just about that physically are located in Dunn County were a part of the Dunn County Responsible Unit. But due to a number of factors, that Dunn County RU dissolved. So then all of those individual communities that used to be all a part of that one Dunn County RU needed to establish themselves as their own RU, because again, you have to be either an RU yourself or a part of an RU. The default in statute is that every local government is an RU, but we have had cases throughout history, and the Dunn County RU is an example where the county said, well, we'll take on that role. We'll be the RU, and have served in that capacity for all the years since. But then with circumstances changing, Dunn County could no longer serve in that capacity. So then again, the local governments were obliged to either become themselves an RU, or we did have some of them that partnered with other neighboring municipalities and formed new multi-member RUs. So there had been 26 communities that were a part of the Dunn County RU. Once the Dunn County RU dissolved, we ended up with, I believe, 12 new responsible units. So again, some of them working together, some of them as individuals. So it's not necessarily that DNR notifies folks that they need to be an RU. Like I say, everyone is a part of one now, but we still have changes every year with maybe a multi-member RU adding somebody new, which is great. Or again, if a multi-member RU separates and then those folks are applying for individual status.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, Rick, please go ahead.
Okay. All right, I had to unmute on both my phone and computer, but I'm good, okay. My biggest area is what was already identified as the DNR's list to look at is that table 1. That's what first comes to mind anyway, as we look at this, knowing that at the time that was created was a different time and era, and waste generation has changed And, now we manage probably much more volume of material, but not necessarily weight. And the what the content of that weight is probably much different proportionally than what it was at that time. So I don't have any answers on, what's the source or method to update that, but that table 1 and its specified pounds is, what I think is most out of date.
Thanks, Rick. I tend to agree with you. We have another one in the chat box. This one from Alex Net over at Outagamie County. Is there, is there a timeline on changing the NR544 code? How soon would the changes take effect?
Yeah, it's another great question. And also, Rick, thank you very much for your feedback. So our plan of attack is to draft a scope statement around mid-January. And then one of our first steps is to get that approved by the Natural Resources Board. The overall rulemaking process is incredibly lengthy. I forget how many steps there are, but it's like 30 to 40. Not kidding. It's really that long. So it's a 3-year process. So we are looking at anything that we would be, working on now and in these coming years going into effect in 2025.
All righty. And then we have a question from Jerry Noiser over at Manitowoc County. Are any of the 2017 forward groups recommendations being considered?
Thanks, Jerry. So the department is aware of the report, to be sure. Full disclosure, some of you may know I participated in the forward group, but with a different hat. I was with Winnebago County Solid Waste at the time. So personally, of course, I am aware of the report and some of the recommendations therein because of a participant in that process. So, it is amongst our resources, our documents of things that we will be, reviewing and looking at. And so I guess, specifically too, this is where, you all as stakeholders, if there's, something in that report that you're like, this is definitely something that we think you should be looking at, that's very helpful feedback to us as well. And I guess too, I shouldn't assume that everyone knows what I'm even talking about. So the forward report is the future of Wisconsin's recycling development. I think I can credit Melissa with bringing that group together. There were multiple people across the state with varying backgrounds, from local government to haulers to MRFs, public and private, different geographical areas that came together probably about, I don't know, when we started meeting, Melissa.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It had to be 5 years ago.
I've been with DNR already for 5 years. So it had to be.
No, really? Oh my God. This gray hair is getting grayer. So it had to 7 years ago. My gosh.
Yeah. And the purpose was to take a look at Wisconsin's recycling system and where we thought improvements could be made. And I don't know if you want to get into more of the genesis of that, Melissa, if that's not necessary for this discussion, but.
Yeah. And actually the genesis came from a legislator who reached out to a colleague who was the public works director up in Tomahawk. And it was really about how do we define success of kind of like to your last question there in general, what should be offered by a recycling program to be effective? What does it look like? How do we define success? And so the forward group got together and produced a report, which can be found on the Arrow's website. I believe it can be found on Wixwama's website as well. And came up with a list of recommendations. Some of them are, of course, pie in the sky, and some of them get to the heart of really closely aligned with what the Legislative Audit Bureau was kind of tugging at in their report as well. I don't want to get into it too much, otherwise it takes over, and people can certainly find it. Another question, this one from Karen Sig at Recycling Connections, and of course our executive director. It says, Does the WDNR hear much about enforcement issues of their ordinances, especially from smaller RUs that may be relying on county sheriff departments that enforce recycling, that enforcing recycling isn't a high priority? I ask this especially in relation to assuring business and multifamily are properly recycling. I also ask because if something isn't enforced, it doesn't seem to matter if it feels like it is still okay to not recycle.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, so I'll try to tackle it to the best of my abilities. So
I'll pop in again, RUs enforcing their ordinances.
Right, right.
Sure. So there's a couple of different, like I say, ways that I'll answer that. One, every single RU on the annual report, we have different columns under the enforcement, and so they should identify if they're, filling out the report accurately, how many complaints they received, if they, did any inspections, if they issued any citations. Those are data points that RUs are supposed to keep track of and provide to us in annual reports, and many RUs do. I mean, we do compile that information on the thousands of different, tags or complaints or whatever that RUs did handle each year. And a good source of that info is the Legislative Fiscal Bureau. They do a biannual informational paper where they ask us for a lot of that data, and of course we provide it. And so that's a really great snapshot on some of those statistics if somebody is interested. From the DNR perspective, I guess we approach this issue in a couple of different ways. One is complaint based. So I do literally get complaints, sometimes just, John Smith, John Q Public gives me a call and says, this business isn't recycling, or this apartment complex doesn't have recycling. And part of my role is then following up with the responsible unit. And I will say I received this information, and the RU is required to follow up on it to see if the complaint is valid or not valid. And if recycling isn't being provided, steps to take to get the business into compliance. I know that's only the tip of the iceberg. I only can react to that which I know about. But I guess in another way that we're trying to be proactive in this way, myself and one of my colleagues were speaking at the Wisconsin Apartment Association conference coming up in Wisconsin Dells on October 15th. So that we see as a really great opportunity to get in front of the owners and managers of multifamily facilities to make sure that they're aware of the obligations and the requirements to provide recycling. I will say that, we do get complaints like this, I think every month, and we track them in a database. So, any specific situation that we become aware of a business or multifamily that's not recycling, we work directly with the RU to bring them back into compliance.
Thank you, Jennifer. Anybody else want to weigh in on the points listed by Jennifer here? And okay, we have one here from Annalise Smith at Waukesha County. Checks and balances are so important to ensure the integrity of the program. However, this also requires more resources. So without additional support, it's difficult to require. I wonder what light lifts, yes, I can say that, light lifts might be possible for additional checks and balances with data that is already being collected.
Yeah, I guess, I'm certainly interested in all of your boots on the ground suggestions on this very component. We do try to already, like I say, have a lot of checks and balances in the annual report. I'm not saying it's perfect by any means, but, we really are trying to get at this, like I say, trying to ensure that over 1,000 programs are providing education, are providing, some sort of enforcement, even if it's complaint based, are obviously collecting all of the required recyclables and things of that nature. And we have a challenge where we have, like I say, a lot of programs. I believe it's around 800 that have a population of 2,500 or less. So we just have a lot of really, really small RUs. And so, how somebody like, a city of Milwaukee or Waukesha County administers their recycling program versus a town that literally we have a RU with a population of less than 100 people. And so the RU requirements are the same. Everyone has to provide education, yet we understand there's different resource limitations with that small town versus that versus a large city or county. So, I guess I'm personally very interested in what other light lifts there are, or how we can do that. Because I agree, the program integrity is so important. And yeah, I guess I'm agreeing and very interested in other ideas on this.
I think that's a really good question that, not only DNR can probably help facilitate getting out, but also Aero and its members. That those ideas on light lifts, I think, are really good because it shows we may already have some of the answer and it can help advance the solutions far more quickly. The next question is, does NR544 currently promote consolidation or collaboration? Would there be more opportunities through a revision?
Yeah, that is also a really great question, Annalise. Thanks for that. I don't know that I would say the code does promote consolidation and collaboration, not in 544. In statute, we do have the consolidation grant. So that's specified in 287 and provides for a small amount of additional funding for RUs that either physically consolidate or do an identified cooperative activity. But in 544 itself, I don't know that we do have a lot in that regard. And so I love that comment, and I'm trying to theorize how we can do that. So I appreciate that, and I'm making a note of it.
I think that's a really good question. And there's this dissonance. And in the dissonance, I think, rests with the fact that the grant is almost designed, the way that the funding is set up is almost designed to make consolidation and collaboration, but not a good idea. Yet the idea is, if we can work more effectively together, there should be more money available for that sort of consolidation. But so that's where that dissonance is. And so I think we need to be able to align, and nobody likes to open up statute, but there may be a need for that.
Right. I appreciate that you brought that point up again, is that unfortunately the grant distribution is not something that we can change. That's outside of this code revision,
Right.
That statute. So, while we could certainly encourage more consolidation and collaboration through this code, that wouldn't mean that you would get more money, which one would like to see. That would be the carrot.
Right. Yeah, and I think there have been discussions about legislative fix, primarily with the formula, and I think we need to be cautious there, because I see the revisions of NR544 as movement in the right direction. We've spent a lot of time learning, as Annalise's question kind of denoted. We have tons of data. We have a lot of programs that have experimented with so many different things and successes and failures. Now it's time to take this opportunity to look at it. But if statute is somehow not aligned with that progress, in other words, if that formula isn't aligned to create the kind of forward momentum of success, we could end up with problems. So I think we still need to be, Aero, all of the RUs of people of Wisconsin, need to be mindful and make sure we don't create a greater dissonance in not aligning those legislative things that we may see with these. So that's my one concern, is all of the good work. The rewriting of code comes around once every generation, and a lot of times this is a great opportunity, and I get excited because I'm a total policy geek, but this is important. And if we can help, again, I think one of the most important questions here is, what should be offered by a recycling program to be effective for its customers? I can't think of anything more important than that question, because we all have to have a common understanding of what effective means. And this is that opportunity. So you go, Jennifer, and make this just perfect.
I don't know that that's possible, but we're going to try to make improvements.
I have every confidence that you will. And it'll everybody on the call today or on the webinar, and others who are not, because this is being recorded, it will be posted on the Recycle More website. Let's not miss this opportunity. And 2 years from now, when the new rules are approved by the Natural Resources Board and become implemented, I don't want to hear, well, if we only would have done this. This is our chance. And I saw it the other night from my elected role. We had dozens of public stakeholder meetings about a change to a corridor here in Stevens Point. Dozens of stakeholder meetings. We go to approve it, and now everyone's going, well, we didn't know anything about it. We don't want that. So don't miss this opportunity. We can shape the future, and the future is all of you. No pressure. Annalise goes, no pressure. This is huge. So, and you are doing the work. We need you. Go ahead, Rick. I see you're off of mute.
Sorry.
Yeah, just another comment on the consolidation / collaboration efforts. It is something we need to be careful of how that's, what we mean by that, because I think that, we had some that seem to have an impression that every town of 100 has their own fleet of trucks and all this, and that was inefficient. People made it sound like we were inefficiently operating programs, and in large part we have that efficient consolidation through and for the majority of Wisconsin communities, privatized collection, and they have their economies of scale in the territories they service. So I think there's a difference between, if we talk about consolidating, like what functions are we talking about? Because I think it makes a lot of sense if we have more regional planning and education, for example, but the majority of the cost in the system that the state dollars are helping reimburse are the service, and I think that, I think when the consolidation grant concept was first born, there was a lot of narrative about communities are inefficient, and I don't think that is the case. So I just mentioned that as we talk about ways to do that. For me, I think the biggest value would be more in the regional planning concept. How do we get, more cities, villages, towns, counties, groups of county? How do we, do more regional planning around solid waste recycling?
I couldn't agree more. We should be doing regional planning for everything from recycling to transit to healthcare systems but that's, my degree is in planning. So it's where greatest bang for our buck is. And we need to erase those jurisdictional boundaries.
Yeah, and I think
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think Rick makes a good point in that because our recycling grant has been stagnant, it's forced people to be more efficient, or that kind of thing, where if there was some fluff that maybe the grant was covering at some point 15 years ago, with those grant amounts staying the same, I think everyone's had to take a closer look at things. So that's a good point. And I do know that we're coming up on time, so I just wanted to also make sure I got a chance to say that, again, this is only one of many opportunities that will be involved with this overall process and getting, stakeholder feedback. Again, this is really our beginning, our introduction to trying to understand what are the main issues with our recycling programs. Again, so just again, if you have any comments on anything that's here, I'll put my contact info back up. Feel free to reach out to me. That'd be great. But this will just be one of many opportunities.
Absolutely. Yep. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you particularly to Jennifer for taking the time to put this together. Thank you to everyone who participated, and thank you to Recycling Connections, our executive director, Karen Sig, for helping to facilitate this. And again, let's recycle more, Wisconsin. And I hope you all have a lovely first day of fall. So thanks, everyone.